Imagine breaking a bone and feeling absolutely nothing. On the desolate ice of Lake Superior, Elias and his dog, Shadow, face a terrifying reality. They are hunted by a squad of elite mercenaries who have been driven mad by the crushing pressure of the deep. These men do not scream when they are hit. They do not stop when they are shot. They only laugh. To save an innocent girl from these unfeeling monsters, Elias must dive into the freezing darkness and turn the deadly physics of the lake against them. But how do you defeat an enemy that does not know how to die? The biting wind of Lake Superior howled like a wounded beast, whipping snow across the frozen expanse in blinding white sheets. Elias, a 42-year-old man with a face weathered by years of harsh northern winters, knelt beside a hole cut into the thick ice. He tugged at the heavy fishing net with gloved hands, his movements practiced and efficient. He wore a worn-out, heavy-duty dark brown canvas work jacket over a faded red flannel shirt, layers essential for survival in this unforgiving climate. His durable blue jeans were stiff with cold, and his short, messy salt and pepper hair was tucked beneath a wool cap, though several days of graying stubble coated his jawline, catching snowflakes that refused to melt. Beside him sat Shadow, a magnificent 5-year-old German shepherd. The dog was large and imposing, possessing a thick double coat of silver and gray fur that shielded him from the freezing temperatures. Shadow maintained a calm, watchful posture, his amber eyes scanning the gray horizon with an intensity that suggested he saw things invisible to the human eye. He was not merely a pet, but a partner in survival, a steadfast companion in Elias's solitary life. Suddenly, Shadow stood rigid. The thick fur along his spine bristled, standing on end. A deep, rumbling growl vibrated in the dog's chest, a sound that Elias felt more than he heard over the gale. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, his voice rough like gravel. Shadow let out a sharp, urgent bark. He was not looking at the catch or the ice. His snout was pointed toward the distant shoreline, toward the small town and the research facility nestled against the cliffs. Elias narrowed his eyes. He knew Shadow well. The dog was reacting to a shift in atmospheric pressure, signaling the worsening storm. But there was something else. A scent carried on the wind. The acrid smell of chemical smoke. Abandoning the net, Elias signaled for Shadow to follow. They mounted their old snowmobile and sped toward the shore. As the research station came into view through the swirling whiteout, Elias killed the engine and slid into the cover of the tree line. Chaos had descended upon the facility. A group of men clad in black tactical gear moved with military precision, their faces obscured by high-tech gas masks. Leading them was a man named Silas, a figure who radiated cold authority even from a distance. He moved not like a desperate criminal, but like a professional soldier executing a mission. A blinding flash of white light erupted near the main entrance, followed instantly by the deafening boom of a concussion grenade. The mercenaries were using flashbangs and signal jammers to disorient the security team without lethal force. Through the smoke, Elias saw 2 men dragging a young woman out of the building. It was Clara, the daughter of the station's lead scientist. She was fighting with every ounce of her strength, kicking and screaming, though her voice was lost in the wind. Her hand clutched tightly at a silver necklace around her throat. Elias's grip tightened on the handlebars of the snowmobile. He understood instantly. They were not taking her for ransom. They were taking her for that necklace. It was not jewelry, but a hardware key, a complex device required to unlock the systems of the sunken ship, the Chimera. Shadow whined low in his throat, his muscles coiled to spring, waiting for a command. But Elias placed a heavy hand on the dog's neck. "Stay," Elias whispered, his heart pounding against his ribs. There were too many of them, and they were armed with electric stun rifles. Silas gestured sharply, and his men shoved Clara into the back of an armored all-terrain vehicle. As the convoy roared away into the blinding snow, disappearing like ghosts, Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The storm had truly arrived, and it had brought monsters with it. Elias stood frozen in the tree line, his fists clenched as the tail lights of the mercenaries faded into the swirling white void. He was about to return to his snowmobile when a figure stumbled out from a concealed hatch near the research station's ventilation system. It was Lucas, a young man in his late 20s with a frantic energy that contrasted sharply with the freezing cold. He wore a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit beneath an unzipped parka, and his face was smeared with soot. He was a marine engineer, brilliant but anxious, known for tinkering with machines until they did the impossible. "Elias, please," Lucas gasped, his breath coming in ragged clouds. "You are the only one who knows the jagged channels of Devil's Island. They have Clara." Elias looked at the desperate young man. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to retreat to his cabin and forget the world. But then he remembered Clara's father, a man who had once pulled Elias from a burning wreck in 1998 when everyone else had given him up for dead. That debt had never been paid. "I am in," Elias grunted, "but my snowmobile cannot catch them on the open ice." Lucas's eyes widened with a spark of hope. He led Elias to a camouflaged shed near the frozen shoreline. Inside sat a monstrous machine. It was a custom-built airboat, a flat-bottomed vessel powered by a massive aircraft propeller encased in a steel cage at the rear. "I built it for the thaw," Lucas shouted over the wind as he primed the engine. "It runs on water, but it flies over ice." Elias threw his gear on board and whistled for Shadow. The large German shepherd leaped onto the bow with practiced grace, his silver and gray fur ruffling in the gale. Shadow hated the noise of engines, but his temperament was steady and disciplined. He crouched low, his amber eyes narrowing as the massive fan roared to life, sounding like a jet engine taking off. The airboat shot forward, skimming over the frozen lake surface at terrifying speed. They drifted sideways through the snowdrifts, the fan screaming as it propelled them toward the dark horizon. Behind them, the roar of engines cut through the storm. 3 of Silas's armored all-terrain vehicles had spotted them. They were fast, equipped with spiked tires that tore into the ice. Flashes of light erupted from the pursuing vehicles. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed over the ice. Bullets pinged off the metal hull of the airboat. The mercenaries were aiming for the massive fan blades and the steering rudders, trying to cripple their propulsion. "Keep her steady," Lucas screamed, ducking as a bullet shattered the side mirror. Elias gripped the control stick, his knuckles white. The visibility was dropping to 0. They were entering a whiteout, where the sky and the ice blended into a single, blinding wall of gray. Shadow stood up on the vibrating bow. The dog did not look at the shooters behind them. His ears swiveled forward, twitching violently. He could hear what the humans could not. Beneath the roar of the fan and the wind, the ice was groaning. Suddenly, Shadow let out a frantic, high-pitched bark and lunged toward the left side of the boat. Elias trusted the dog more than his own eyes. He jammed the control stick hard to the left. The airboat skidded violently, spinning almost a full 180 degrees. Just feet away from where they had been heading, a massive fissure had opened in the ice, hidden by a thin layer of fresh snow. The black water of Lake Superior churned below, a deadly trap for anything that drove into it. The airboat skirted the edge of the abyss, spraying ice chips into the dark water. Behind them, the lead pursuer was not so lucky. The sound of screeching brakes was followed by a sickening splash as the first ATV plunged into the freezing water. Elias corrected their course, gunning the engine to disappear into the wall of snow, leaving the remaining enemies shouting in the distance. Shadow sat back down on the bow, shaking the snow from his coat, his gaze fixed steadily ahead. The roaring fan of the airboat finally sputtered into silence as Elias cut the engine. They drifted into the jagged shadow of Isle Royale, a place locals whispered about with dread. The storm had momentarily broken, leaving behind an eerie stillness, amplified by the towering limestone cliffs that loomed over them like ancient tombstones. They concealed the airboat beneath a heavy tarp camouflaged with pine branches. Shadow moved first, his silver and gray body blending perfectly with the rocky, snow-dusted terrain. The German shepherd lowered his belly to the frozen ground, crawling up the ridge with the stealth of a wolf. Elias and Lucas followed close behind, keeping their profiles low against the skyline. Below them lay a hidden cove, sheltered from the wind, but not from the biting cold. Bright halogen floodlights cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene of industrial chaos. Silas had established a forward operating base on a thick shelf of ice that extended over a partially flooded cave entrance. Elias pulled a pair of binoculars from his jacket and peered down. Through the lenses, he saw the mercenaries moving with a strange, disjointed rhythm. "Something is wrong with them," Lucas whispered, shivering as he huddled next to Elias. "They are moving like marionettes with cut strings." Elias adjusted the focus. He watched a soldier drop a heavy oxygen tank directly onto his own boot. Instead of screaming in pain, the man simply stared at his crushed foot and let out a high-pitched, hysterical giggle. Another mercenary was shaking violently, his hands trembling so hard he could barely hold his rifle, yet his eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on nothing. "It is the gas," Elias murmured grimly, lowering the binoculars. "They are diving deep. To save money and time, Silas is likely using a cheap mixture of helium and oxygen, skipping the necessary nitrogen buffers." Lucas looked confused. "What does that do?" "It causes high-pressure nervous syndrome," Elias explained, his voice tight. "It fries the nervous system, tremors, nausea, vertigo. But worst of all, it strips away fear and inhibition. They are not soldiers anymore, Lucas. They are high on pressure. They feel no pain, and they have no judgment. That makes them incredibly dangerous." In the center of the camp, suspended by a heavy crane, hung a rusted, reinforced diving cage. It swung ominously over the black water of the cave mouth. Elias shifted his gaze and saw Clara. She was being dragged toward the cage by two of the twitching, grinning mercenaries. She looked small and terrified against the backdrop of the dark water. "They are going to drop her," Elias said, checking the magazine of his flare gun. The wreck of the Chimera sits on a ledge 100 meters down. That cage is her only protection against the crushing pressure, but if those lunatics are operating the winch, she might not survive the descent. Shadow let out a soft, vibrating whine, sensing the tension radiating from his master. The dog's muscles were coiled tight, ready to sprint down the cliffside, but he held his position, waiting for the command that would unleash him into the chaos below. The freezing wind whipped around the limestone cliffs, masking the sound of Elias snapping the breech of his flare gun shut. He looked at Lucas, whose eyes were wide with terror, as he watched the scene below. The mercenaries were erratic, their movements jerky and unpredictable due to the pressure sickness ravaging their nervous systems. "We cannot fight them head-on," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the gale. "We have to make them look the other way." Elias raised the orange flare gun, aiming not at the camp, but at an unstable overhang of snow and loose rock on the far side of the cove. He pulled the trigger. A sharp hiss sliced through the air, followed by a brilliant streak of red light. The flare struck the rock face with a dull thud, detonating a small charge. The explosion was not large, but it was enough. A cascade of rock and heavy snow thundered down the cliffside, crashing into the frozen lake with a roar that mimicked a massive landslide. Panic erupted in the camp below. The twitching soldiers shouted confusing orders, swinging their weapons toward the noise, their drugged minds amplifying the threat. "Go," Elias commanded softly, tapping Shadow's flank. The German shepherd did not hesitate. While every human eye was fixed on the falling rocks, Shadow became a phantom. He slipped down the treacherous, icy slope, using narrow crevices that no man could navigate. He moved low to the ground, his gray fur blending seamlessly with the shadows of the machinery. Shadow reached the perimeter of the technical tent. A guard sat slumped against a crate, his head lolling forward in a chemically induced stupor, a tactical radio resting loosely on his knee. Shadow crept forward, his paws making no sound on the snow. With surgical precision, he clamped his jaws gently around the rubber antenna of the radio. The guard muttered something incoherent, but did not wake. Shadow turned and vanished back into the darkness, returning to the ridge within minutes. Elias took the radio from Shadow's mouth, praising the dog with a silent stroke of his ear. He tuned the frequency, listening to the chaotic chatter of the enemy. But the small victory was short-lived. Below them, the winch motor roared to life. The diving cage, with Clara trapped inside, began to descend rapidly into the black, churning water. "No!" Lucas screamed. Before Elias could stop him, the young engineer broke cover. He scrambled down the scree slope, shouting Clara's name. It was a foolish, desperate act of love. 3 flashlights snapped toward Lucas. He didn't make it 10 yards before a mercenary tackled him into the snow, pressing a stun baton to his neck. Elias closed his eyes for a brief second. The element of surprise was gone. He stood up slowly, raising his hands in the air, and walked down into the light. "Don't shoot!" Elias shouted, his voice booming with authority. Silas stepped forward, leveling a pistol at Elias's chest. "Give me one reason not to end you right now, old man." "Because your gas mixture is wrong," Elias lied smoothly, his face a mask of calm. "I watched your men. They have the shakes. You are feeding them bad air. If you try to open the airlock of the Chimera with that crew, the pressure differential will blow the hatch and kill the girl instantly." Silas hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. He looked at his trembling men, then back at Elias. "I know the ship," Elias pressed, stepping closer. "I know the valves. You need me to stabilize the pressure, or you lose your prize." Silas lowered the gun slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Get him a suit," Silas ordered his men. The descent into the abyssal blackness of Lake Superior was a journey into a frozen void. Elias felt the crushing weight of the water pressing against his dry suit. His left wrist was shackled to Lucas's right with a heavy steel pair of handcuffs. Beside them, swimming like a shark in the gloom, was Silas's lead diver, armed with a pneumatic spear gun and a flashlight that cut a narrow beam through the suspended silt. Lucas was hyperventilating. Elias could hear the younger man's ragged, panicked breaths through the water, a rhythm that would deplete his air supply in minutes. Elias squeezed Lucas's gloved hand, firmly, a tactile command to breathe. In, then out. Slowly. He looked into Lucas's face mask, his own eyes calm and steady, anchoring the engineer against the creeping terror of the deep. Above them, on the icy platform of the cave, the storm had passed, leaving a tense silence. Clara stood near the edge of the water, shivering violently. Silas had kept her on the surface as insurance, forcing Elias and Lucas to retrieve the black box from the wreck of the Chimera. A mercenary stood guard over her, his weapon held loosely, his attention split between the hostage and the monitors displaying the diver's progress. Clara spotted a flicker of movement in the shadows of the rock face. It was silver and gray. Shadow. The dog had not fled. He was waiting. "I am freezing," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Please, I need a blanket to block the wind." The guard grunted and turned to grab a tarp from a crate, momentarily obstructing his own view of the generator. Clara dropped her hand to her side and made a sharp downward gesture. Shadow launched himself from the darkness. He did not attack the man. Instead, he targeted the lifeline of the operation. With a powerful snap of his jaws, the German shepherd severed the main fuel line of the diesel generator. Fuel sprayed onto the snow, and the machine sputtered, coughed once, and died. The sudden silence was deafening. Then the floodlights mounted on the rig flickered and died, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. Shadow moved instantly. He sprinted to the far side of the cavern and let out a deep, ferocious bark. Then he dashed to the opposite side and barked again. To the blind and disoriented mercenaries, it sounded like a dozen police dogs were closing in from all sides. Panic took hold. The guard, fearing a raid, abandoned his post and scrambled toward the exit. 100 feet below, the lights on the divers' suits went black. Elias knew this was his only chance. He braced himself against the hull of the sunken ship and pulled his hand against the steel cuff. Gritting his teeth, he forced his thumb joint inward, dislocating it with a sickening pop that vibrated up his arm. The pain was blinding, but his hand was now narrow enough to slide through the metal ring. He was free. The mercenary, blind in the darkness, fired his spear gun wildly. The bolt whizzed past Elias's ear. Elias pushed off the hull and wrapped his arm around the mercenary's throat from behind. It was not a kill move, but a sleeper hold. He squeezed the carotid artery, holding tight until the man went limp in the water. Elias fumbled in the dark until he found the emergency lift bag attached to the heavy black box Lucas had located. He grabbed Lucas's harness and clipped him to the bag as well. With a sharp tug, he pulled the inflation cord. Compressed air hissed violently into the bag. It expanded instantly, becoming a rocket of buoyancy. Elias let go, watching as Lucas and the prize shot toward the surface, a rapidly rising star in the endless night. The surface of the cove erupted with a violent surge of white foam. The emergency lift bag breached the water like a surfacing whale, carrying Lucas and the heavy black box with it. The force of the ascent was catastrophic for Silas, who had been leaning over the side of his small Zodiac boat, waiting for his prize. The heavy containment case struck the side of the rubber craft with a dull, sickening thud, flipping the vessel and sending the mercenary leader tumbling into the freezing embrace of Lake Superior. Silas hit the water and gasped. It was an involuntary reflex, the immediate shock of the cold stripping the air from his lungs. His muscles, already ravaged by the nitrogen tremors, seized instantly. He thrashed helplessly, his eyes wide with the realization that his greed had led him into a tomb of ice. He began to sink, the weight of his tactical gear dragging him down. Suddenly, a hand gripped his collar. Elias broke the surface, gasping for air, his dry suit glistening in the gloom. He saw his enemy drowning. A lesser man would have let the lake claim its due. But Elias was a rescuer, a man who had spent his life fighting the water to save others. He kicked his fins hard, dragging the paralyzed Silas toward the rocky shelf where Clara and Shadow waited. With a grunt of exertion, Elias hauled Silas onto the ice. The mercenary was blue-lipped and not breathing. Elias did not hesitate. He tore open Silas's vest and began chest compressions, his movements rhythmic and practiced. Breath, pump, breath, pump. After a tense minute, Silas coughed violently, expelling water and retching onto the snow. He was alive, defeated not by a bullet, but by the physics of the lake he had underestimated. From the distance, the sound of sirens cut through the receding wind. Blue and red lights flashed against the cliff walls. The Coast Guard cutter, guided by the emergency frequency from the radio Shadow had stolen, was navigating the channel. The remaining mercenaries, blinded by the dark and disoriented by the cold, surrendered without a fight. In the confusion of the rescue, Lucas was pulled onto a stretcher by paramedics. He sat up, wrapping a thermal blanket around his shoulders, scanning the crowd for the man who had saved his life. "Elias!" Lucas shouted, his voice hoarse. But the spot where Elias had been standing was empty. Lucas looked toward the tree line. The fresh snow had already begun to fill a set of boot prints, flanked by the paw prints of a large dog, leading away from the chaos and into the deep silence of the forest. Hours later, the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gold. Deep within the shelter of the pine forest, a small fire crackled, casting a warm glow against the snow. Elias sat on a fallen log, his back resting against the rough bark of a pine tree. He held a simple wrapped burger he had kept in his survival pack. He tore it in half, tossing the larger portion to Shadow. The German shepherd caught the food mid-air, swallowing it in 2 bites before licking his chops contentedly. The dog circled twice and laid his heavy head on Elias's knee, letting out a long, deep sigh. The tension of the night evaporated, replaced by the quiet bond between man and beast. Elias scratched Shadow behind the ears, looking up through the canopy of trees. Above them, the sky was a brilliant, endless blue. They were cold, they were tired, and they were penniless, but as the smoke from their fire drifted up toward the heavens, Elias knew they were something far more important. They were free. True freedom is found not in the battles we win, but in the lives we choose to save and the quiet paths we walk thereafter. Elias and Shadow remind us that even in the deepest freeze, the warmth of a loyal companion is the only fire we truly need. If their silent bond spoke to your heart today, please leave a gentle like and share this story with someone who believes in the power of kindness. Subscribe to be part of our journey into the wild, and let the adventure continue by choosing the next story appearing on your screen now.